Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Travel Trends. I'm Dan Christian, and today we have a extremely special guest, someone I deeply respect and admire in the travel industry, someone that many of you know. He is the CEO and founder of Skift. Welcome, Rafat. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's a pleasure to speak to you. And to give everyone a bit of context of your background, which clearly you've had a great deal of business success. So going back even before you started Skift, which is now 10 years ago, going back to 2012, you had actually had a startup before that, which was paid content, Content Next. You sold that to Guardian in 2008. And prior to that, you were active in journalism. You were the managing editor of the Silicon Alley Insider. So you have a very impressive story. But I think for me, one of the things that really stands out is to know Skift is really to know you. And although we've known each other for a number of years, elements of your personal story only recently came to light. And there was a great example you recently shared just after Father's Day, a post that your father had shared with you when you were living in Indiana. So you were born in the UK, but primarily raised in India. You did a computer science degree, and then you moved to Indiana, of all places, and you pursued a master's in journalism. And it was tough going for you. And so I'd love if you just briefly tell that story, because I think it was obviously a poignant moment in your life, and it was a really powerful letter for me to read.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I had actually forgotten about that letter until 5, 6, 7 years ago in my house in India, my family house where my mom lives. I rediscovered the letter, and then obviously everything played in my head. And my father was already ailing at that point. And I knew at some point when he passes away, that letter was going to help me mourn him. And then I know I would have to tell this story because my whole life has been a storyteller. So I would have to tell this story. And this was a letter I was, I think, 6 months into, or a few months coming from India to Indiana, completely different cultures, just separated by one alphabet, and was having a hard time adjusting to life in Indiana, which was a university town. And coming from a culture, and also college life, as you can imagine, in the US is very much driven by party and alcohol, neither of which I was used to. So I don't drink. As a Muslim, I don't drink. I didn't, certainly didn't drink then, and was having a hard time adjusting to the culture and just generally America, and wanted to go back, as I think you mentioned. I did a phone call back to my mom. She panicked of like, what's going on? What's happening to my son? And so my dad wrote me this 6 or 7 page letter, and which traditional Indian dad, or I guess a traditional dad in those days, was the strong and silent types. And I didn't really have like a conversations with him as I was growing up. It was very much a respect type relationship, mainly being afraid of a stern father. He softened later in life, and we are 5 siblings. So the younger siblings had a much different relationship with him than I did. And so I said that this is probably the longest I ever talked to him, even though I wasn't talking, in the sense that he wrote this long letter to me about how I'm so lucky in life to have a chance to come to America from a place like India, very sort of middle-class existence, and study here. So 1, I should be thankful of that. And 2, how to overcome this loneliness and I guess bordering on some sort of depression. I didn't understand that at that point, of overcoming that, which is something that, now this letter was 99. So we're sort of talking almost 25 years now of creating your own space, creating own meaning into your daily existence, and taking the bull by the horns, if you will, and make your own way in life. And he was obviously talking in context of that particular moment in time for me, but in many ways, his aspirations of what he was outlining for me about making your own space in the world has very much played out, which I didn't realize until obviously I rediscovered this letters. Turns out that's how I have lived my life. So I think that was very helpful. And when I posted this letter, the post that you referred to, I posted it 6 months after he passed away in December 2019. So this was in the depths of COVID. And I know your story and my story intersect in many ways on how much COVID meant to us in terms of how we reinvented or at least rethought our lives in many ways. And I guess we'll discuss this a little bit. And 6 months into it, I was having a hard time mourning him. And I go into this post of why that happened. That happened because initially in cultures like India, I was not allowed to mourn him because I had to stay strong for my mom and my sisters and family. And as soon as I came back after a couple of months in India after his passing away, COVID hit. So I was just busy rescuing the company, so I didn't have a chance at all. And like 4 months into COVID, even though we were in depths of COVID, I sort of started the process of mourning, and I wrote this letter, reread this letter a few times, and then posted this letter and posted this post. And so that's the context.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for publishing and sharing it. I think one of the things that's unique, you have a remarkable business story, but what truly makes you unique, as far as I'm concerned, is your authenticity, your transparency, and the fact you're willing to share. You talk about being an exhausted dad with 2 kids and one day being able to write a letter to your son in a similar context. And you certainly, you do share, you have an opinion, you have a view, and you're here to contribute. And all of those things really resonate with me. And for those of you who would love to read it yourself, please, rafat.org. You will find many amazing and inspiring blog posts. And you will also find that letter, which the one part that certainly stood out for me, I was comparing the letter with a post you did when you turned 46 and you were sharing some advice. And I appreciated some of your advice as well. But the one that stood out for me, because obviously it directly connects to my personal story, is on page 5, your dad makes this particular statement, which is that most of the time, job becomes first priority. But in the case of a disturbance related to health, either of the self or a family member, the job slides to second position, and then health of the family member takes first place. And as you know, that was certainly my experience on my journey, because I had a very difficult decision to make, and I decided to step away from a significant corporate role to take care of my dad. And I am so glad that I did. And every time I see something like that, it reminds me of the fact it was the right decision. And there wouldn't even be this podcast and this opportunity to speak to you had I not made that decision at the time. So again, thank you for sharing and that inspiration. Now, tell us a bit about your family and then where you are. So you're in Queens, New York, and you are very busy traveling, but you've got 2 young boys who are 4 and 8 that clearly inspire you to do your best every day with your business. But how are you and the family doing today?
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, I live in this neighborhood called Astoria, which is a very diverse neighborhood. I know many of your listeners may have heard of Astoria through the Greek neighborhood. So people come here for Greek food, even though now it's not just a Greek neighborhood, it's Bangladeshis and Arabs, and this is New York. So it's a very diverse neighborhood. I have 2 boys, 8 and 4. We went as a company, Skift went completely remote as a company. So we had an office in Manhattan next to Penn Station. We made a decision very early on to be completely remote as a company. So my life is completely intertwined with kids and family. And so it used to be that we used to fit life in between work prior to pandemic. This is how I sort of think about it. Now it's the opposite. I fit work in between life. So I work when I can in between the day. And the one, I guess, luxury that I have as the CEO now of a company that's into year 11. So it's a more mature company, is that I can set my own schedule. And my work isn't linear as a CEO and founder now in year 11, my work is not linear. And so I'm able to do that, but boy, it's intertwined in so many different ways. And I'm also an older dad, which there should be, by the way, an older dad podcast, but that's a separate discussion. We had kids late. So as an older dad, the responsibility to stay fit and then take care of kids, and obviously now my almost 80 kids, if you will, in the company, as the size of the company, is a lot of work. But it's fun. This is why we do what we do, because it's hard, but it's a lot of fun.
I think you said kids are worth every pain they give you for the joy they give you.
Correct.
So that was one of your insights. But so moving on the personal story to your journey in starting Skift. And I would love to hear it from your vantage point, because we've known each other a number of years, and I've seen the success that you've had, and also how you navigated the pandemic with your team, which I do want to talk about today in terms of the team culture and the amazing dynamic, your initial trip to Iceland, your recent trip. So there's a lot of ground I want to cover today, and I've been so looking forward to this conversation. I think I was telling you before, I got 12 pages of notes, and so I will use up as much time as you give me, because I think there's so much to share. But I would love to just talk about the origin story of Skift itself, because if people want to see your success before, clearly that's there. They can look that up. And you've spoken about that previously, but you took 2 years off, you traveled, and you decided, I think you'd registered the domain name, Skift, which is which was a Nordic Swedish word for shift and digital transformation. And so, but you finally had the time to have some time away and actually look back at the travel business. And clearly you were someone, 99, you mentioned that letter. So when just prior to 9/11 and the dot-com downturn, so you lived through those moments, in the years following your dad writing you that letter. And so I would really like to understand from your vantage point, going back to 2012, what made you decide to really jump into travel and the business of telling the travel stories?
Right. Yeah, let me just say that you should be if you weren't what you do in business, you would have been a journalist, because you obviously are very good at background research. So the genesis of Skift wasn't, so I traveled for 2 years. I sold my first company, as you said, to Guardian Media Group. I had a 2-year lockup. This was so we sold 3 months before the financial crisis. This is July 2008. We had a lot of goals of expanding into US. Guardian was a UK-based company. We were a US-based company. A lot of those goals we couldn't meet because the financial crisis hit, and we were a small company when I sold my first company, 25 people. I think we're down to like 11 or so by the time the cuts got done. In their defense and Guardian's defense, they were also laying off hundreds of people back in the UK, much like every other company in the financial crisis was. So I left after a year and a half, and they just said go. They paid me out for the rest of the 6 months or whatever the contract. And so I went to Iceland as my first, I took a 2-year sabbatical. It wasn't meant to be 2 years. I kept on traveling, and it ended up being 2 years. I started my first sabbatical. The first country I went to was Iceland, and it was the week after that infamous famous volcano stopped. And just so that I booked my trip many months ahead, and the volcano happened. I didn't know if I was going to be able to go. And so I kept on traveling for a couple of years out of New York and London as my two bases of places to go. London happens to be just a lot easier to go into these more isolated places in the world. Whether it was Mongolia, Outer Hebrides, Comoros Islands, Uzbekistan, so very random countries that I went to, or less travel countries. And not that the idea of Skift came in like middle of Mongolia. I said I want to solve the world's travel news problems or something like that, but it just the way in which travel intersects in the world with every sector, and how vast the industry is, its influence is, versus a media information brand that covers it with that amount of seriousness. I didn't see it. And so I said, I'm going to start what initially the pitch was. I want to start the Bloomberg of travel, news, research, conferences for the travel industry. That initial pitch is essentially what the last 11 years have been. Obviously, the contours of how we built it, different parts of it, variations of it have obviously changed from the initial pitch deck. But the larger contour of that, we want to be the Bloomberg of travel on a global basis, has remained. And I think that part is important, which is like you certainly believe in the core mission of creating something that you stay true to. And initially the goal was for us to not just create a B2B media company, but also then to create a B2C travel news publication as well. We discarded that pretty early on just because we realized there's so much to do at the B2B side. And so that's the early genesis of what Skift was. There obviously are a lot of trades that have existed forever in the travel industry, people that are focused on hotels or airlines or online travel or cruises, etc. Our thesis was that in an age where consumers are in control, they have digital tools, globalization has happened, they don't care about the industry silos per se. There needs to be a business information media and information brand that speaks about that collapsing of silos, if you will, across these various parts of the travel ecosystem, and talks about it in a big picture way of what focused on the industry, but talks about it in a big picture way of where the future of travel is going, which is why you know us for Travel Trends, because we're very much focused on where travel is going. Not in like 10 years from now, because that becomes too futuristic, but like what's happening now, what's coming in the next year, what's coming in the next few years. And the lens that we used early on and has continued of looking at the travel world, because obviously you can look at it from various different ways, has been tech, marketing, user experience, and design. So that at the intersection of tech, marketing, user experience, and design, we felt was the best way to look at what consumers are doing and how that's affecting the business of travel and how it's reacting. So that's really what it is. Since then, obviously, we've learned a lot about the industry. We were naive outsiders. I don't have a background in the travel industry. My co-founder, Jason Clampett, who you've met, came from the consumer travel guidebook world. He was at Folders, Fromers, etc. And so, and then we hired Dennis Schall, who I think you obviously know very well, our executive editor, employee number one. He was the most veteran, I guess, of the travel industry world, having covered it at various publications over the years, the online travel part. And so that naive outsider view of like, oh, we're going to create something that cuts across all these silos, which initially people laughed at and said, oh, this is not, like, who cares, like a generalist travel industry thing versus a very specialist, for instance, hotel industry thing. But turns out that's what the industry needed and wanted. And obviously 11 years later, we have a different story.
Absolutely, you do. A very successful one. And I wanted to ask you specifically on the voice of Skift when you got this business off the ground. So you mentioned you were an outsider coming into this industry. You had real strong industry veterans as well, partnering with you in creating this new venture. Jason, of course, and Dennis, who I want to speak about as well, because I certainly greatly respect him. And it relates to the question I want to ask you now, which is that when I started in travel, corporate travel, I would go into the lunchroom and I would find these magazines, these travel industry publications, which was new to me at the time. And I have to say, and this is by no means intended to be disrespectful, but it was informative, but it was dry. The content wasn't captivating. And so, and when I discovered Skift, it was fresh. It was edgy. It all of a sudden had a new tone and voice to it. And even before I knew your background, clearly everyone has the sense now you're a global citizen. You've lived in multiple countries and you've lived on both coasts. And so even when you ran your last company, you were in Santa Monica. You're back in New York now. I always saw Skift as an East Coast, New York voice. And maybe that's because of Dennis, but I'm curious to know, not that you were Vice. There's obviously, that's a totally business unto itself, which has blown up spectacularly more recently. And so it's a good thing you didn't go down that path, but you clearly made some decisions fairly early on around the Skift brand. And I would just love to know, was the voice, the intention, the tone, and even the interviews that lends itself to the interviews you'd conduct on stage and the hardball questions you'd ask people, was that very intentional from the beginning to captivate?
Yeah, it was. Thank you for noticing that. And that's a good true line you've tried to paint there. So my first company was a blog. So it started as a blog, turned into a media company. If you know anything about the blogs or the early evolutions, they always came with a voice. So it was a solo blog that turned into a media company. I was a journalist covering the business of media with paid content, my first company. And that voice was always a part of how I did journalism, meaning I was reporting in the industry, but also I was not just a reporter, but I was also an analyst / opinions on things that were happening. These opinions were based on reporting. when we started Skift, we were very particular about having a voice, because the voice is the only way we assumed, correctly, turns out, that we would break through. And as you said, the trade industry that existed prior to that was boring. And for everything we know about the business, just the promise of travel, like nothing about travel is boring. And how can we, a new industry publication, bring that creative promise of travel into the voice into the brand that we create? So we were very particular about a few things. We had opinions on everything, even if we didn't know what the hell we were talking about. So that helped. Over a period of time, we obviously learned about the industry more. And as I said, Dennis had opinions because he had experience in it. We had a sense of design, meaning one of the things I've always learned and obviously practice as well is design helps you punch above your weight. Meaning, if you're a small company, but your website, mobile, any type of digital channel is well designed, well thought through, fresh, people have a perception of, oh, they know what they're doing, or they're bigger than they are, or their voice is more valid, etc. And so we learned from the best of consumer web media publications at that point. We didn't have that much money because we were just starting out. Initially, I funded it, and then we raised some angel funding as well along the way. And so the design, the yellow color that you've seen people associate Skift with yellow, that was very intentional. Even now, if you come to a Skift conference, you'll see like everything is very well thought through in terms of stage and chairs. Even the chairs on stage have to have a certain look. Everybody, including me, wears a certain type of dress. They always have to have yellow on them. And we don't necessarily impose them. It's just part of our brand. And so the voice and the look and feel is part of what has built our reputation, if you will. And it's very important for us.
And how did you find in those early days when you're shaking up an industry? And I'll give one specific example that really stood out to me when I was at Skift in New York, and Dennis Shaw was interviewing Dara, who was the CEO of Expedia at the time. Many people now know Dara as running Uber, and maybe that's why he left Expedia. But Dennis was hitting with a series of hardball questions, and he kept his poise, to his credit. But some of those questions even related to conversations that Dennis had either overheard or had been relayed to him from a dinner conversation the night before. And you could see the surprise on Dara's face as the litany of questions continued. And eventually it got to a point where Dara said, "Are there no softball questions? Because if you're only going to have hardball questions, I'm not coming back next year."
Yes. And he did say that in jest, by the way. That clip is a great clip. So sorry, your question is?
So I was there in the room when that happened, and it felt electric. So I hope people do go and find it. And that to me was one of those examples where you are paying attention because something new is happening. You haven't seen this before. You haven't seen these executives be put under that level of scrutiny. They're not there just to do an infomercial and promote their business. And you guys really pioneered that approach. And so I wanted to just understand how do you successfully, again, this is where my question comes in, is that how do you then successfully then court them as advertisers and court them as partners in the research when you're going to ask tough questions? Because I have to say, I was terrified when Dennis interviewed me in San Francisco in 2018 because I wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Dennis is great. Dennis his interview style is just a style. It's an art. You have to see it on video or be there in person to be able to. It's so great. So, and by the way, Dara has since subsequently come as CEO of Uber. In fact, this year at Skift Global Forum, he is a speaker there at the Skift Global Forum. I'm going to interview him on stage myself. So the one thing that we created an informal environment at the Skift Global Forum with an idea that typically CEOs that are used to very sort of corporate conferences don't wear suits and ties. We instruct their people, like if it's a public company CEO, we actually instruct their team to, like, there's the guideline. So what it helps, it brings some sense of informality which is a proxy to them being a little loose on stage. And then it works with most people. It doesn't work with everybody, but it generally, that's our guideline. So like come with for this informal discussion on stage. And in that informality, they probably say more than they would say at a more formal industry conference. So certainly that's part of it. The second is they know that we're prepared. Our journalism on skift.com is basically what we're trying to recreate on stage. One of the things I do try to tell our moderators in our company is like, you're inviting somebody into your house, so you're not going to piss in the air. So like there has to be a respect. The other thing is these CEOs are not CEOs of public companies by chance. Like they have gone through all types of, they've heard everything, even if they haven't heard it on stage, like if you haven't heard it stage. So it's not like they're not prepared. Dara is fully capable of answering any type of hardball questions. And this is true for Brian Chesky, who the CEO of Airbnb, who now speaks at our conferences as well. And I think we have more in-depth discussions on stage, and I've interviewed him for the last 2 years. He's coming again this year. That he doesn't get at other industry conferences where it's more softball. I think by being, many of these CEOs or top executives see us as peers, even though we're not, like I'm not a travel industry. We're not a travel industry. We're not a travel company. We're a media company. But I think our influence is such that in many ways they see us as experts and peers. So they're able to have a more elevated conversation than they would typically with a journalist who occasionally covers it as part of their beat versus, if it's a other mainstream industry conference or something, or some other business conference in general. So I think there are many variables there that we are able to do. And the other thing that Dennis is very good at, and I think our other journalists learn from him, I certainly learn from him. You ask a question to a CEO, they know how to deflect it because this is what they're good at if they don't want to answer. Then he's going to reword it somehow, if not directly following that question, but somehow later in the interview, he will reword that question and bring it up again. So like you attack from many angles, and so you get something out of them. So I think that's the context, particularly with Dara, which is just a funny clip. But anyway, that's the context.
Cool. That's fascinating. Well, let's talk about how that relates to the culture that you've built inside the company. You've mentioned a few of the great people that joined you from the very beginning. You're now at a team of 75 plus and growing. Seeing your recent trip to Iceland, where your journey began, was wonderful. And not only because of the shift that you successfully made from having an office in New York to having a remote culture, which not everyone agrees with, as you know, a hybrid approach. And Barry Diller, in fact, who was interviewed, obviously the chairman of the Interactive Group, who owns Expedia.
In our conference last year, correct.
Yeah, he was being interviewed remotely, and one of your team members mentioned you don't have an office, and the shock on his face, it looked like he was going to take the microphone off and say, I can't believe I'm being interviewed by a company that doesn't have an office. This is preposterous. But people on your team like Dennis, who we both clearly have a great affection for, he moved from New York to Puerto Rico. The guy looks the best he's looked in his entire life, as far as I've known. He's
living his best life. He really is living his best life.
He's like Benjamin Button. He's reverse aging. He's like a young Brad Pitt now. Yeah. And so that's fascinating to me, because a lot of people in companies, they age rapidly, the stress level. And so clearly you've been able to retain people, bring people into the business, and people are, in many cases, the happiest they've ever been and doing their best work. And I would love to understand a bit more about how you've been able to achieve that. So moving to remote is one, but you've moved to remote, but you're still in New York. That's where you've chosen to be with your family. But tell us a bit more about the culture within Skift that's enabled you to now be succeeding on this side of the pandemic, to have navigated it and now be rising on the other side of it.
Yeah, so let me answer that question by actually bringing up an article that I wrote last year, whose provocative headline was "Don't Create Culture." And so what that and the follow-up to that is create meaningful work, meaning by focusing on the quality of the work that we do we create meaning into people's lives, work lives, such that they then are happier as part of Skift, which then creates the culture. So I think that's kind of how we sort of reverse engineer it, if you will. At the end of the day, it's, work is the majority of the business. The other thing we try and say is, like, culture is not this thing that you put at the end of work to make work bearable. It should be work that should be bearable that creates the culture. And a lot of it has to do with, and our culture has changed quite a bit, I would say, from a physical company, meaning in-person company, to being a remote company now. We're now, as you said, 75 people are spread globally, but in US, we're spread everywhere. My co-founder, Jason, moved to London. Carolyn, our president, who I think you know as well, she's splits the time between Miami and upstate New York. Dennis, as you mentioned, is Puerto Rico. People we've hired since 2021. We stopped hiring in 22, like everybody else. I think I've hired in New York 2 people in New York out of like the 40 people I've hired. And we're a dozen people in London. We have, I think, 6 people, soon to be 6 or 7 people in India, Philippines. We just hired somebody, South Africa. So globally spread team. And one of the things that we put a lot of effort into is, how do we stay connected? Because everything else follows. If people feel connected and seen and appreciated, everything else follows. And it comes from the top. I'm very focused on it. Our executive team is focused on it. Mariana, who's our head of HR, is focused on it. Everybody's very intentional about making sure we use this thing called Basecamp, which is I'm sure many of your listeners have heard. It's our virtual headquarters, if you will. We put a lot of effort into making the best use of Basecamp and how people get recognized, appreciated. We aim for, we don't always get there. We aim for an asynchronous work, meaning people work in their own time zones, not on American time zone, if you will. It works well. It continues to be a North Star. I don't think we'll ever get like 100% asynchronous, because obviously it can't. A lot of the teams have to have work that coincides. Obviously, you need time with your manager or different team members as well. So that's part of it. The other thing that we're very, very, very particular about, as we talked about family and life, is that the work-life balance, which in many ways is a cliche term, and there are many opinions on you shouldn't use that word work-life balance. But whatever the import of that is, my goal and our company's goal is that get your work done in time and go live your life. And so that, again, that's not achieved always. Journalists work probably more than others, just because sometimes it's news breaks and after hours work happens, and now we're a globally spread company. But the intent is there. But even if the intent is not there, then there's nothing we'll aim towards. So at least the intent at all times is for us to make sure that, and we're very, again, I'm going to use the cliches, but I'm going to say it anyway. We're a very family-friendly company. It also comes from us founders and our top team having either young kids or kids in their family life right as we're building this company. And so for us, for me, the point of pride of people working at Skift is, especially the young people, if they come and, I don't know, meet their boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, get married, buy a house, have kids as part of Skift, that's very meaningful to me. That shows that they're comfortable taking major life decisions as part of Skift, which means we're doing something right. So this, at the end of the day, and I don't know if we're going to get into this, but I'll say it anyway. Like 11 years in, my role has changed a lot, where so much of my work is communication internally, and obviously externally that you've seen. But internally, a lot of my work is communication and talking to not just my direct reports, but different people in the company. And I think that hopefully reflects. We're very wary of politics in the company. We're humans, so I'm sure there's some, but we're also very particular about not creating competition inside the company, even in sales team, I just don't think that's a healthy environment. So a very supportive culture as much as we humanly possibly can. The other side of it is we're not an adult daycare, so don't expect you can't expect to get meaning of life from Skift. You're coming here for work. So there's a balance between being as supportive as humanly possible, and yet you're sort of still, this is still work. And one of the things, last thing I'll say, one of the things I've said to our team, and I try and practice as much as possible, and we alluded to it early on, is like in scheme of things, you and your health is number one, your family and friends are number two, and work is number three. And if I, as the founder, say that again and again and again, it gets internalized. So I think that keep hearing that is important. So that's what's created our culture, if you will.
Absolutely. And I think you've just come up with the title of this podcast, which is Skift is not a daycare. And do not listen to this podcast if you're searching for the meaning of life.
Adults daycare. Take care for adults. Please don't put that as a title.
In all seriousness.
Well, in all seriousness, one of the things, like, there's, since we're talking about work, I'll say this. There's a movement in general in work, and has been for the last, 5-10 years, of bring your full self to work, right? There's a phrase that comes particularly with the millennials. It came about that. My philosophy is, please don't, because you'll be disappointed. You're setting yourself for disappointment, because work cannot give you all meaning in life. And that's there needs to be a separation between work and your personal life, especially in a remote world, because it's so easy to mix both of them. I mean, certainly I'm a case study of it and try to separate it as much as possible. But yeah, so that's what we try as a company to try and tell our team and live it.
That's great. You do. And I would say the example of that is the fact you've been able to integrate other businesses into your organization. You highlighted about avoiding friction within the organization, the competition that otherwise sometimes does occur, and some of the politics that result from that. But you not only have been able to successfully grow Skift as a core business, and obviously there's kind of the three core aspects of your business: there's the conferences, there's the subscriptions, and there's SkiftX as well, where you create some amazing content working with a number of travel brands. But then you also have brought on Airline
Weekly, Daily Lodging Report, and then we bought something called Event MB that's now called Skift Meetings. So we've bought 3 publications over the last 4.5 years.
Exactly, yeah. And so how does that work? Because I really appreciate you clarifying the approach. So rather than focusing on culture, focusing on the work itself and the inspiring work. And really, has that then helped you integrate those businesses? Are they fully integrated into Skift? Do they all see themselves as one team?
Yeah, they are. And various stages of, so Daily Lodging Report we bought in 21. So that's the newest one. We came close to buying 2 businesses last year. Unfortunately, weren't able to come to terms, but we are in the middle of closing one now. So hopefully that will happen in the next 60 days. And we have so for us, it's the growth is both organic and inorganic. In a company like ours, in a sector like B2B media, you have to sort of bring all business models along. What I mean by that is you can't just have one business model, let's say advertising, and scale that as big as possible and expect that to be a big company or that to be the sole revenue generator. In a vertical focused company like ours, it's focused on a specific subject, which is the global travel industry. You have to bring all business models along. In media, they're relatively known. There's, as you said, advertising, subscriptions, and conferences, the 3 main lines of business. We started a 4th one called Skift Advisory, which launched last year, and we're still early phases of that's a industry-focused advisory business as well. And these publications that we've bought, the idea is that these are usually, and somehow we specialize in like husband-wife run publications. 2 out of those 3 were husband-wife run newsletters that have existed for tens of years. Daily Lodging Report is 28 or 29 years of being a newsletter, which is incredible. And so we come in and modernize the stack, if you will, tech stack, marketing stack, design, everything. And then figure out the pricing. 2 out of those 3 are subscriptions, so we try and raise the price depending on what the industry dynamics are, and then we create a conference on top of it. So we've done that with Airline Weekly. We have done that with Event MB, which is now called Skift Meetings, and with the Lodging Report, we've actually done very, very well in terms of modernizing tech stack. We haven't yet started a full conference on top of it, but hopefully that's to come. And we're not just looking at buying publications that we bought, like traditional read bought publications. We're looking at buying, as I mentioned, we started Skift Advisory. So the next company that we're hopefully to close is in that space. So it's not a media publication. We're looking at data companies that will potentially roll into Skift Research as well. And we're looking at companies not just in US, but outside of US as well, because our business is quite global. I mean, Middle East has suddenly become second largest part of our business for all the reasons you can imagine, knowing that region very well yourself. So much is happening in that part of the world. And so that's how we look at it.
That's great. And you've certainly started to speak about the future of Skift. And that was really the last question I wanted to ask you on this topic. And I'm keen to get your feedback on some of the travel trends. I know we'll only be able to cover some of the surface of that today, but I think those people listening to this would definitely benefit from understanding what you're seeing as the major trends in travel. But before we do that, one of the questions I was keen to ask you was about the future of Skift and really your inspiration as well. So we'll kind of package this together. I mean, you were recently at the Cannes Lions Awards. You spent some time in France, which I find spending time outside of our industry and bringing back, sometimes that's where you provide the greatest insights. And I actually even used your AI tool on your website to ask about the future of Skift. And it gave me an answer about that Skift will likely continue to expand its global presence.
It did? Okay, I should ask that question. I should get some ideas from the tool that we created.
Yeah, well, apparently your company's also going to strengthen its editorial team, journalism efforts, continue the commitment of the travel industry, which I appreciate. And you're going to remain curious about travel's place in the world. You're going to ask hard questions and constantly come up with new ways of looking.
Wow, that's actually a very accurate answer. So I'll say we created the right tool. Those are my words that I wrote along the way that it actually picked up.
Must have been. So yeah, tell me how you see the future of Skift. You've certainly already talked to that, and also some of the inspirations for you going forward.
Yeah, and I think that the inspiration really, I'll say that this sounds like a total cliche, but it was the reason why I started Skift, which is like the creative promise of travel and what it means to the world, what it brings to the world, the joy that it brings to people. There obviously, we can discuss the downsides over tourism, climate change. Those are all certainly issues that are layers underneath it. But the creative promise of travel, that it's the most progressive expression of human curiosity. You and I sort of fully embrace it in our personal lives, is what animates Skift. It animates me. Travel as a lens to understand the world. Because travel intersects with the movement of humans, basically intersects with every issue in the world. COVID was the opposite. The stopping of the movement of humans was obviously how you understood COVID. So for us, it was a very important topic, besides obviously directly affecting the global travel industry. The movement of humans essentially underpins every big issue in the world, every big and small issue in the world. And I think that animates me 11 years in. And our goal is how do we constantly come up with new ways of looking at the industry, and hence new ways of looking at the travel of the world. And which is why we do sometimes do these things where we coin terms. Sometimes it looks like a gimmick, but there's a method to the madness, which is unless we come up with fresh ways of looking at the world, some of that includes coining fresh terms, some of them stick, some of them don't stick. Our goal is to surprise and delight the travel industry in many ways, for them to say, oh, wow, I didn't expect to see this from Skift, or to think about travel in this way. Last year, I wrote this essay. I don't write as much, but for Skift on a daily basis. But when I do, I try and do like big think pieces. And I wrote this thing called The Great Merging. There's this essay called The Great Merging, which is a long essay, which in March or April 2022 was a relatively new concept of how we live, work, socialize, and travel are merging into each other, which certainly has happened over COVID, and what that means for how is it reflecting in in the different parts of the travel industry, airlines, hotels, destinations, etc. And it was an original thought. One of the biggest things that I'm keen on is how do we put out original thought into the world? Because that for me is the biggest bar for us as a company. Like, how do we constantly keep putting out original thought into the world? And so that's a big part of what we do. There was a second part of the question that I'm forgetting now.
Well, just in terms of inspiration. So I thought you were highlighting that.
Inspiration.
Yeah. Where you get your inspiration from and bring it back to travel.
Yeah. So widely read. This is a hugely important part. Read as wide as you can in different parts, as you said, bringing lessons from other industries, retail, history. I'm a big fan of reading business history books. And in general, history books. Early, like I've back in the days, Monocle magazine. I don't read it as much now, but Monocle is a lifestyle magazine that I was a fan of. Continue to be. I just don't have time to read it as much now. It's a very eclectic collection of global things in the world. So, very random things. Like I remember an insert in that magazine had a certain design that I took and told my design team in 2015 to say, this visually looks very interesting. We're writing this manifesto on the future of travel. I wrote this in 2015. You may have seen it. Manifesto on the future of travel in 2020. I wrote this in 2015. We got inspired by the design for it in a totally random, completely unrelated thing in Monocle magazine. So again, bringing influences from different parts of the world, which is why I'm very much against siloed thinking. And my superpower that I've realized, and I'm 49, so I'll turn 50 next year. Superpower that I've realized in hindsight, my first company and my Skift as well, is joining the dots across different, seemingly unrelated industries, sectors in travel. Different industries don't think that they're part of a single industry. Airlines don't talk to the hotels, etc. So joining the dots across these seemingly disparate sectors that are connected, and then connecting them to the larger world. In many ways, that's exactly what I did in my first company, Paid Content, recreating it in Skift. And so a lot of it is just having a wide sense of curiosity that just so happens that travel enables that curiosity as well. So it just sort of everything connects in my mind, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I really appreciate you sharing that.
And you're asking the future of Skift. Let me give you quick on that. It's to continue to expand geographically. So for us, different parts of the world where we're not today there, Southeast Asia, where we were prior to the pandemic, I want to go back in soon. Middle East has become a large part of our business. India is becoming a very important market for us for many reasons. And then go deeper into different parts of the travel industry. We bought these publications, we're buying other things and creating other things. We just launched something called the Skift Short-Term Rental Report, which is a subscription newsletter 3 times a week that we launched on our own, that goes deeper into the short-term rental sector beyond the coverage on Skift that we create. And so it's to go deeper into different parts, geographical expansion and horizontal, going deeper into, not horizontal, vertical into different parts of the travel industry.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly clear. I mean, I really appreciate you spending the time talking about the future of Skift and your focus. And I think that is a good segue into the trends. And just so we can spend a few minutes on those, because clearly that's what a lot of people have come to listen for. And I think actually most of our conversation they're going to get more from, because they can go and read about trends. But the conversation that we're having now is, your journey, your story, Skift. And so this was the conversation I was ever so keen to have with you. But I definitely want to touch on some of the trends that you are seeing today as travel comes back. And I guess what I'm asking is, from my vantage point, I love seeing what has changed in human behavior as an outcome of this. And I think we've touched on it a bit in our conversation. And then where travel behavior still remains constant. But I'd love if you maybe could just give us an overview of 1 or 2 areas that you are seeing as travel comes back They're the top trends that you and the team, that are recurring themes that you're focusing on and telling that story.
Yeah. So I'll say this, and travel itself is a megatrend. We use the word megatrend a lot. We cover travel megatrends. But if one thing COVID has proven, it's that the desire to travel, no matter how much you clamp on it, will come back stronger than before. Meaning travel as an aspiration for human societies as they progress in their economic evolution, particularly countries that historically were, let's say, developing countries, you don't call them that anymore, emerging countries, have a desire. Certainly if your earning power hits a certain threshold, we've done research on this on Skift research, your desire to travel increases as a result of the country economically progressing, which means travel as a megatrend has been proven 100 times over itself in COVID itself. The various sub-themes were falling on this. The rise of India, for instance, as a demographic entity, it crossed China as the most populous country in the world today. GDP not there yet, but the mass of people coming out of India to go into different parts of the world will be a bigger force than Chinese outbound traveler has been over the last 10, 15, 20 years. It will become it in the next 5 to 7 years, maybe even earlier. You're seeing a version of that with what's happening in the airline world, where Air India and Indigo Air have just placed the biggest orders in history. India is the fastest growing airline market. And it's not just faster growing, but also just a giant market. Middle East airlines, the big forces that exist in the world, Qatar, Turkish, Emirates, etc. Their whole business is propped up by Indians moving around the world transiting through these Middle Eastern hubs. So just the power of India. So we're certainly following that as a global force. Of course, this you've talked with your previous guests as well, what AI is going to do to the travel industry. So much early promise there. We ourselves are using it in our business as well. For me, the biggest thing that I latched onto early on when it was launched was the travel search box, which has basically stayed the same for the last 20, 25 years. You put the destination, if you're talking flights, put the destination, do the dates, hotels similarly, and you get back a list. Has stayed the same since, 96 or 97, 1996, 97. And the ability to change that, which there were a couple of promises along the way. Voice search was there, the messaging apps were there, etc. None really proved out. Now when conversational, and by conversational I mean chat-based or voice-based, search behavior in a larger context, not just in travel, larger Google type context. If that changes, which is what these large players want us to do, ChatGPT has certainly shown that, then it will come to travel search. If it comes to travel search, what does it mean for how people discover and make decisions and then book travel? And so I think that's the biggest piece of the pie that AI will help on the consumer side. On the back end side, too long to go into, but you already know this, efficiencies on operations and digital transformation, all the stuff that you worked on, I know, in your previous role as well at Travel Corp. And so it's just a huge, so certainly we're following that. We are also following what we call the financialization of travel, where companies like Hopper and other fintech players have come in and have had many innovations on how you buy travel, and how and that have unbundled travel insurance, if you will, into different parts. Booking has adopted it, Expedia. So everybody's experimenting with the financialization of travel booking. Another trend that we're following. Of course, sustainability. So what travel means to the world in terms of travel's effect on climate change, and how that intersects with over-tourism is another fascinating topic that we were covering pre-COVID. Post-COVID, how much of business travel is lost and what it means, and what new forms of business travel or hybrid travel are coming up. That's another big theme. I think the consensus as we're in 2023 now, business travel, is that about 15 to 20%, it's topping off at 75 to 80% pre-COVID volumes, business travel. It also intersects with obviously an economy not being that great, but that's generally the number. If that's the new reality, that we've lost billions of dollars of business travel, for now being made up by companies on the leisure side, meaning leisure continues to be very strong, the rates are very high. What does that mean? And then in general, related to what is the future of work? Because whatever the future of work is what the future of travel is. Because one, people get money from work. That's how they get money to travel. Two, it's what allows you time to travel. Like if you're a remote person versus a hybrid person versus a fully in-office person, your travel habits are different. So whatever technologies and policies and cultural norms come in future of work, that's what will come. That's what is the future of travel. So that's why I say watch the future of work versus trying to figure out what the future of travel is.
So many valuable insights there and trends that you've pulled out. I just want to go back to one in particular when you talked about travel discovery. I know we talked about AI, of course, because it's a very important theme, and we're going to see a big quantum leap forward. I know you've interviewed Fred Lalonde from Hopper and Brian Chesky, who you mentioned, of course, from Airbnb, two companies that are doing fascinating things that have really built innovation into their DNA of their business. They're able to adapt very quickly, seize new market opportunities. And listen to Brian more recently talk about the fact that travel discovery is broken by virtue of the fact that people still have to search where and when. And that almost every travel site you go to, you start with those two criteria. And you just say, then you end up with results. And it's about refining them. It doesn't start with who you are and what your interests are. And I think that's a shift they're looking to make. And some of the startups that I'm working with.
Yeah, Airbnb Brian Chesky has been thinking about it. And he says that they will launch something in the next, 12 calendar months or something like that, that will take a crack at intent, and not just intent, but also your history. Like every time we search, it's a dumb box. Like it doesn't know anything about our habits. It should have some semblance of it, right? We're in an age where that's entirely possible technologically today, especially with the new moves in generative AI. And so I guess that's your question. That's where you're trying to get to.
Well, that's exactly it, Rafat, which is that you are clearly having those conversations as well and seeing that change and what's about to come, what's right around the corner. Because when I look back, as you mentioned, my role at the Travel Corporation for many years, one of them was this 10-year wallet concept of trying to make sure that travelers continue to book within the 40 brands in the group. So one year they'll take a river cruise, next year an African safari, they'll stay at one of the hotels, they'll take a tour. And you can only do that by virtue of understanding who the customers are, their intent, their previous travel history, their spending, their age. And I think that's where it gets really exciting for the companies that have that data or are able to mine data like that to be able to shape traveler future booking behavior. So it's clearly a very exciting time to be in this space. And I was just saying that some of the startups I'm working with are thinking along those lines and trying to get to market with solutions. And that's where we're going to see some real significant shifts in the year ahead. And I know you always take keen interest to profile those startups and bring those to the forefront. So we've covered a lot, and believe me, I do not want this conversation to come to a close. I'd gladly spend the rest of the day with you, Rafat, if you'd make the time, but I'm
vice versa. Thank you.
But I do want to make sure that I ask you the quiz questions. And the reason for the concept of the quiz really was to inspire people and to make them intellectually curious. And so I've tried to customize each of these quizzes. It's really not about getting 5 out of 5, because poor Zach, who's the producer of this, got 1 out of 5 and he's still beating himself up about it. But the importance is to ask the questions and be able to enlighten people who may not be familiar with some of these answers. So let's take on the travel trivia, if you will. I'll put you on the hot seat and throw you a few hardballs for a moment, and then we'll wrap this up for everybody. So question number 1, Rafat, is going back to India, there is a city known as the Pink City. And if you could tell everyone
Yes, Jaipur.
what the name is and why it has that name.
So Jaipur is a Jaipur, Jaipur. So Jaipur is a city in Rajasthan, the desert state in India, in the western part, which is called the Pink City because the houses, the limestone that they use for the houses, the historical, not the new ones, but these are historical buildings, have pink limestone, and so that's what it is.
Well done. And one for one, and I've had the opportunity to be there and to travel India, and it's obviously a beautiful part of India. And so hopefully those of you who are hearing that for the first time, Google it, look at images.
Don't go in summer. Yes, Google, but don't go in summer. That's the only advice that I'd have. It's too hot.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Question number 2. Indiana is home to what famous annual car race?
NASCAR. Oh no, I'm sure NASCAR, but I just don't know what the name of the race is.
The Indianapolis 5.
Indy 500. Indy 500. Yes, of course I know that. Indy 500. Never mind. Yes.
There you go. Which is in Speedway, Indiana. Did you ever get there when you were in Indiana? Did you ever see? No.
No, I should.
Not a reason to travel there necessarily, but yeah, it's a part of American history, no question. I mean, it's been around since 1911. It's a very interesting history for car aficionados. So sticking on the U.S., closer to home for you in New York City, the New York City subway, the Metro subway, is one of the largest in the world. And I'm going to give you 3 options here. How many stations does the New York City subway have? Does it have 100 stations, 250 stations, or over 400 stations?
So my 8-year-old son would actually know that answer. I'm just going to guess the highest number, 400 plus.
Well done. Yeah, it's actually your son would know, it's 472. And it's...
He could probably name 400 of those 472. But yes.
Well, let's see if you can name this one, but clearly he will as well. You live in Queens, as we discussed, in Astoria specifically, but obviously that's one of the boroughs of New York. What is Queens named after? Where did the neighborhood of the town of Queens get its name?
I should have known that. I guess I don't, but is it named after the Queen of, like, that's got to be some connection to the Queen of England, right? No? Very
close. No, I got to give you a half point for that. But it was originally settled by the Dutch. And so it was actually named in honor of Queen Catherine.
I should have known that, yeah.
Yeah, to pay tribute to Queen Catherine.
I'm going to go ask ChatGPT after this.
Absolutely. So you got 3 out of 4, and we're going to bring it home here with number 5. And this one will be a region of the world that you're clearly passionate about. It's about Iceland. I would love you to tell the audience, why is Iceland called Iceland and Greenland is called Greenland?
Oh, I thought it was just a joke thing, but certainly, but I don't know the reason. Certainly Iceland, Greenland doesn't have green in it, no green, and Iceland does have green. But I don't know is that the reason why?
I'm going to give you I'll give you the mark for that one. But they were both named by Norse Vikings, but the Iceland was actually given that name specifically as a way to deter colonizers or rivals. So it was a very strategic move to discourage other people from settling on the island, to make it seem cold, barren, and inhospitable, which it's anything but. However, they actually wanted people to move to Greenland. So they actually came up with the idea of Greenland to attract potential settlers. So it was a marketing tactic. But the reality is exactly what you said, is that Iceland is greener than its name implies, and Greenland is icier than its name implies. So really, they should be reversed. But anyone who looks at a map, hopefully after listening to that, you can have a new appreciation for that part of the world.
Things that I learned.
Well, thank you, Rafat. I'll give you a solid 4 out of 5.
Appreciate it.
Of course. No, thank you very much for making the time for me today. It really is an honor and a pleasure to speak to you. I wish you much continued success, my best to the team, and I look forward to seeing you at the Skift Global Conference in September. I'll leave it to you for the last words.
September 26 to 28.
There you go.
All right. Thank you. If you want to know more, go to live.skift.com. I'll do that plug. But thank you again for asking me to speak. I'm a huge fan. and now a regular listener to your podcast.
Thank you, Rafat. And thank you to all the listeners. I hope you really enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I'll tune in for the next episode. Thank you so much.